Vsauce, Michael.
The US national debt hit $22 trillion in 2019. That equates to $67,000 per person, including men, women, and children. But interest rates are low on US government debt. In fact, that shows that investors are confident the US will be able to pay it back. Why is that? Well, that's today on the Wall Street Team. After World War II, due to the war effort, the US government was running massive deficits up to 30% of its GDP. For comparison, right now, even with stimulus packages and the stay-at-home orders, that's only suspected to be at 19% of GDP. So what gives? People were fearing an economic collapse, the US defaulting on its debt. But none of that happened. The economy kept on growing and old bonds were transferred into new bonds, meaning the debt didn't really go anywhere, but the debt to GDP ratio kept on going down. That gives us a hint about why the debt doesn't really matter. You see, the reason why our debt doesn't really matter is because it's more about managing it than paying it off. You see, unlike a person, the US gets its loans by selling bonds. For example, the $2 trillion coronavirus stimulus package is being paid for by both investors and the Fed, who are buying treasury bills, or essentially lending the government money. In fact, 2/3 of US government debt is held by the public. Managing the debt primarily means paying the interest payments, and that interest rate is really low. If you look at the 10-year treasury rate, or the rate of interest the government pays on its 10-year loans, it's only 0.67%. That means the debt burden is quite low and there's not much risk of the US defaulting. The reason interest rates are so low is because US government debt is one of, if not the safest investments in the world. And because the risk is so low, investors are willing to loan money to the government at relatively low interest payments because they'll know they'll get their money back. US debt is considered so safe because 1, the Fed is one of the best central banks in the world, and as a result keeps the US dollar very stable, so there's not much risk of major inflation. 2, the US and the greater world borrows in the US dollar. That's a currency the Treasury can print. So worst case scenario, if the Treasury doesn't have the funds to pay off its debt, it can just print the money it needs. That means the Treasury will never default on its debt, unlike other countries like Greece. And actually, because it can print the money, that means something like what happened in Greece can never happen in the US. What happened in Greece was that when it started using the euro, a currency it can't print, it had a very high debt to GDP ratio. As a result, investors became fearful and started charging higher interest rates. But those higher interest rates in turn made it harder for Greece to pay off their debts, which caused it to end up defaulting, which led kind of in part to the Eurozone crisis. 3, the economy is very strong, and that means it becomes easier to pay off your debt. You see, in 2017, 18.8% of US GDP was government revenue. That means it was going to the government, which was about $3.6 trillion. That means, theoretically, the government could pay off all its debt within just a decade. Well, if it's so easy, then why doesn't the US just pay off its debt? Well, debt is only a problem if you can't pay it off, or other people think you can't pay it off. And clearly, investors think the US can pay off its debt if it needed to, due to the low interest rates they're charging. But the thing is, if the US did want to pay off its debt, it would likely have to cut government spending and increase taxes. And that's not a very popular move if you want to get re-elected. That's the reason why Congress doesn't really want to decrease the debt and keeps on raising the debt ceiling. But running a government deficit and then taking out loans to pay for that deficit might actually be a bad thing and counterproductive. This is the market for loanable funds. You'll notice it looks like a supply and demand curve. On the y-axis, we have interest rates, and on the x-axis, we have quantity of loanable funds demanded. The graph looks the way it does because of that high interest rate. People are not demanding many loans. Remember, this is people who are taking out loans and buying loans. At that high interest rate, they're going to have to pay more, so not as many people are going to want to take out loans. It's not a good time right now. However, suppliers are very willing. Remember, suppliers are the people who are lending the money. They're very willing to lend money and supply loans because they're going to make a lot of money off it. The opposite is true at low interest rates. At low interest rates, demand is going to be high because it's a good time to take out a loan because it'll have a low interest rate. But suppliers, it's the opposite for them. They're not going to make as much money. So let's say to pay for a deficit, the government starts borrowing money. That's going to shift the demand curve to the right, signaling that demand is increasing. That's because the private sector and the government are now borrowing money. But the thing is, that's going to raise interest rates, as you can see. And at that interest rate, the private sector is only willing to borrow this much. So now the private sector is going to be borrowing less, which means there's decreased investment. And investment is an important part of GDP and the economy. So that could actually decrease economic growth. This effect is called crowding out, and it is a very important part of macroeconomics. Alright, that finishes today's video. If you're a little bit confused, let me summarize real quick. Unlike a person who has to pay off all their debts within a certain amount of time, it's usually a short period, the government isn't restricted by such time limits. They have a much longer time to pay off their debt. As a result, what matters more is making sure that they could pay off the debt or managing the debt. But because interest payments are low, and also as the economy grows, it becomes easier to pay off the debt. The government is pretty good in this department. The debt burden is pretty low because the government isn't really paying much on the debt, and it could pay off the debt if it needed to. That's why the debt doesn't matter. I really encourage you to go look at my macroeconomics unit. I talk about a lot of key concepts on it, and that's all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.